From August 1977 to September 1978, a series of events took place which stunned the nation and have subsequently become one of the world's most shockingly infamous poltergeist cases.
You understand that you really shouldn't be in this house?
That was a very strange house, and something very strange was going on there.
Everything that you know about poltergeists occurred in that house.
They were scared out of their wits. They just didn't know what was going on.
Reports of levitation.
Floating around the room in midair, and it frightened the life out of us.
Possession.
There was no doubt that the voice was coming from Janet herself.
Come on, my name's Boris. Let me hear you say it. Boris.
Furniture and objects being moved and thrown when nobody was around.
The sofa would flip over or a chair would move across the room.
Just couldn't document everything on this case. I mean, things happening absolutely all the time.
This was unlike any case that had gone before and left a permanent mark on all those that were involved. This is the story of the Enfield poltergeist. In 1980, a book entitled This House is Haunted was published and recounted the Enfield investigation in explicit detail. However, the book's author, Guy Lyon Playfair, got involved in the case quite by chance.
I had experience of a very long and lively poltergeist case in São Paulo, Brazil, and I wasn't really hoping to do any more. We happened to have a lecture at the Society for Psychical Research, which I was a member of, on the subject of poltergeists, as it happened, and I was sitting right next to another new member called Maurice Gross, whom I hardly knew except to say hello to. And at the end of the lecture, Maurice jumped up and said, "I'm investigating a very interesting case right now, and I need some help." And there was a resounding silence. So I turned around and said, "Don't mind helping out for a couple of days or a week maybe," and that ended up 14 months.
Maurice Gross was investigating disturbances at the home of single mother Peggy Hodgson and her 4 children. It was a normal council house like 1,000 others across North London. However, on the evening of the 30th of August 1977, this normal family home bore witness to some decidedly abnormal activity.
Well, the activity started on the 30th of August 1977. Janet complained that her bed was wobbling, and also her brother Peter's bed was also wobbling as well. And the mother just ignored and just thought, you know, they're just getting up to stupid stuff.
But the following night, things became even more bizarre.
On the next night, the 31st of August, that's when other people started to experience what Janet and Peter were experiencing. And quite simply what happened, it was around about 9:30, Mrs. Hodgson put the children to bed, and then all of a sudden she heard it's like a crash.
Peggy Hodgson, the mother, went up to her daughter's room to chastise them for making a lot of noise and for actually staying up late at night.
When she went to leave it, a chest of drawers by the door pulled itself out as if trying to obstruct her, and she pushed it back and then it pulled itself out again.
Undeterred by that, she tried to push the chest of drawers back against the wall, and she successfully did that, and then all of a sudden it started to move back out again. And this time when she tried to put her weight behind it, she couldn't move it at all. It was like some other force was pushing it.
Peggy and the children were terrified, and not knowing what to do, turned to their neighbours, Vic and Peggy Nottingham, for help.
The Nottinghams didn't really know what to do, for the best. They tried to calm down the Hodgsons, but that was having no real effect because of the things that they experienced.
Even on that first night, they consulted with the neighbours, or they went over in terror to their neighbour's house, to Vic Nottingham. He went to investigate and he experienced things.
Eventually, I think it was Mr. Nottingham decided that the only people that could really call out was the police.
On the evening of the 31st of August 1977, the police came to Green Street and were able to convince Mrs. Hodgson to re-enter her house.
Just two police officers arrived and they did a tour inspection of the house, and at first nothing happened, nothing untoward.
But it wasn't long before the activity started again. A large armchair apparently moved unassisted about 4 feet across the living room floor.
PC Heaps, we've got her recollection of the events on record as witnessing the levitation of a chair, the movement of a chair.
I was impressed by the statement made by the woman police officer, because she seemed to have seen something quite clearly, which was a chair that moved, apparently without any propulsion, and she investigated to make sure it hadn't got something attached to it. I thought that was quite a clear, lucid report, and also very courageous of her to speak out when probably she was the subject of a lot of mockery after that.
Enfield case was documented from day one when they called in the police. That's not bad, I mean, to get a testimony of a police constable on the first day.
When people report seeing things like that to you, that's one thing, but when trained observers like police officers witness these things and then they actually sign written statements, to the effect that that's exactly what they saw, it adds more weight to these sort of cases.
On Thursday, 1st of September 1977, at approximately 1 a.m, I was on duty in my capacity as a policewoman when I received a radio message to Green Street, Enfield. I heard the sound of knocking on the wall that backs onto the next door neighbour's house. There were 4 distinct taps on the wall, and then silence. The eldest son pointed to a chair which was standing next to the sofa. I looked at the chair and noticed that it was wobbling slightly from side to side. I then saw the chair slide across the floor towards a kitchen wall. It moved approximately 3 or 4 feet and then came to rest.
But despite first-hand experience of this alleged supernatural phenomena, the police were powerless to help the family.
They were very considerate, they were very nice to the family and said that this really wasn't a police matter. They couldn't find anybody breaking the law. They were anxious to help if they could, and they really couldn't.
Over the next 3 days, these strange events continued for Peggy and her children. Plastic, toy bricks and marbles flew around, seemingly of their own accord, and when picked up, they were hot to touch. A vicar and a local medium visited the house, but were unable to help.
They were scared out of their wits. They just didn't know what was going on. They'd never heard of the word poltergeist. In fact, the girl used to call it the polka dice, and they had absolutely no idea of the same thing happening to anybody else. These things are not amusing for the people who are having them.
There were relations of the family who I met, and they said that if they sat on a chair it got twisted around, or a child got apparently thrown from a chair into the middle of the floor.
They always come in the same order, which is interesting. It's as if the poltergeist was reading from a script. You start with knocking, rapping on the walls, and then you get small objects being thrown, and then you get larger objects being thrown, and then you get tables and chairs turning over, sometimes completely, flip-flop.
The family felt confused, terrified and alone. More than anything else, they were asking, why us?
It's very hard to tell why it should be any particular victim, because the experts will all tell you that you've got to have a tension in the family and break up of the parents and so on.
Poltergeist activity has been noted for occurring in places where there's a bit of tension in the atmosphere, where there's a bit of unrest in the family, or there's there's some sort of trauma that the whole family are experiencing at the time. And in this case, with the Hodgsons, that was part of the course.
It was quite turbulent, quite negative because of this early split between the parents.
There had been a break-up in the family, but then practically every other family is broken up nowadays, but you don't get every other family having a poltergeist. They are very rare.
To most experts, there is a distinction between poltergeist activity and phenomena usually associated with a haunting.
Parapsychologists like to differentiate between hauntings and poltergeist. Hauntings are traditionally location-focused, whereas poltergeist is traditionally person-focused. The other difference is hauntings can go on for years, for decades, for even centuries, whereas poltergeists are traditionally very, very short-term. So they may be a few weeks, months, and in rare cases, leading up to a year or longer. And that's why the Enfield poltergeist is so special, because it's about 14 months in length.
By the 4th of September and near breaking point, Mrs. Hodgson again turned to the Nottinghams. Not knowing what else to do, they called in the press.
No one would be able to convince me that there wasn't something very odd in that house.
Things would just happen. You walk in the house, things would just take off, fly around, flip over, do this, do that.
On the evening of the 4th of September 1977, a call was taken at the Daily Mirror, recounting almost unbelievable activity at the home of Peggy Hodgson and her children in Enfield, North London.
The night news editor was a great character called Tom Merrin, and the phone kept ringing with the Nottinghams, who were living next door to the Hodgsons. And Tom tried to get rid of it in the usual way, which is fairly short, but Vic Nottingham kept ringing back.
Convinced by the Hodgsons' plight, reporter Doug Bence and photographer Graham Morris were dispatched to the Hodgson home.
We knew nothing about the story at all. We were just told that there was something going on in a house in Enfield.
And I knew the area pretty well. I'd been at school there, so I knew all around there. And we found the street pretty easily, and we went into the Hodgsons, met them, and they were clearly in a right old state, the family. But newspaper people are very sceptical, and they were clearly very distraught, but nothing happened at all.
According to Playfair's book This House is Haunted, as the newspaper men were leaving, the activity picked up again.
We came out of the house, got in the car, and then Vic came running out. We went back in.
Yet photographer Graham Morris remembers things a little differently.
The mother and young children had been taken into the neighbour's house and were being looked after there. The whole point was that we were to go in first and wait for the family to come in. And it was as the family were then brought in, the children were brought in, some of them still asleep, then suddenly things started flying around the room and things were taking off, only little things like children's toys, Lego bricks, stuff like that.
Regardless of which testimony is correct, both newspaper men agree on the bizarre events which followed.
The two girls were screaming. I hesitate to use the word paranormal. Something was going on there, and Graham was hit by a brick, and Lego bricks hit the wall, and I've no doubt that happened.
I'm just concentrating on photographing it. I wasn't really that worried. There were things that were just bouncing off walls or flying around, and then suddenly a Lego brick on it was quite a sharp corner on a Lego brick, whacked me in the eyebrow, and left a mark there for a few days. Lucky it didn't hit me in the eye.
These photographs were taken around the time of Morris being struck.
It was quite weird. It was quite upsetting. It was disturbing to be in there, because certainly if you've got no answer to anything, you've got no reason for any of it to have happened. It's not logical.
They could have, of course, been flicked by somebody, but the position of the people and the force of the brick and the angles were wrong. I could see it as if it were yesterday, I could see the people in the room, and no one will be able to convince me that there wasn't something very odd in that house.
A senior reporter at the time was so impressed with what Bence and Morris told him that he followed up the story himself the very next day.
We couldn't offer the services to deal with this. We didn't have the facilities. Or we could get the story and we could get photographs, but we couldn't do anything else.
There was growing concern amongst senior Mirror reporters for Mrs. Hodgson's well-being. In an attempt to aid the situation, they called the Society for Psychical Research, the SPR.
The Society for Psychical Research was set up in 1882 to investigate those faculties of man, real or supposed, that are not explicable on any generally recognized hypothesis. It doesn't have any fixed ideas or opinions, and anyone can be a member whether they actually believe in paranormal phenomena or not, but of course obviously most of us are convinced that there is some reality in these things.
The SPR assigned the case to one of their members, Maurice Gross.
Maurice, who unfortunately passed away summer 2007, was an inventor. When the Enfield poltergeist case started, Maurice Gross was kind of a fledgling investigator. But he went into the case actually with a very objective mind. He initially interviewed the entire family and was always thinking about alternative explanations and questioning everything.
It's interesting to see a guy turn up with a handlebar moustache looking like a World War II fighter pilot and driving an E-type Jag, and then being there for the Society for Psychical Research. You don't think that the two go together.
He went out of his way to befriend the family. He was not after an easy, quick answer.
Despite his level-headed approach, Gross was soon convinced the phenomena was genuinely paranormal. Not long after arriving at the house, he himself was witness to strange occurrences.
Lego bricks were being thrown, marbles were being thrown. Morris observed that the marbles, when they landed on the floor, they didn't actually bounce, they just stopped dead. But then things started to escalate a little bit more. It was things like, the furniture was being hurled around. The three-piece suite, I think, was even overturned at one point.
Another chair gone over. It should have landed on her back.
The red chair's turned over backwards. Anybody on it?
Yes, he was like this on it.
Janet was sitting on it at the time it was thrown over backwards.
But each stage in the Enfield poltergeist case, you've got witnesses from very different backgrounds being brought in. Initially it's the neighbours, and then it's police officers, and then it's newspaper reporters, and then it's Society for Psychical Research investigators.
You understand that you really shouldn't be in this house. You do understand you shouldn't be in this house. You do. That was, again, 2 knocks.
There was knocking in the house. The kids weren't anywhere near it at the time, so it wasn't them. We knew it wasn't them. If you'd taken it out of context, if that had happened in your own home, you wouldn't have worried about it at all. But the fact that it happened there, and you're surrounded by 16 people from the Society for Psychical Research, and there are cameras and all the rest of it, you think, this knocking must be important.
Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Are you having a game with me? Oh, right. As I asked the question, are you having a game with me? It threw the cardboard box and the pillow right at my face.
That was a very strange house, and something very strange was going on there.
We're all standing this side of the room, and over that side of the room, that drawer has just opened on its own in that cabinet. Now, how do you explain that? You can't, so that was worrying as far as I was concerned.
Working alongside Gross, journalist Doug Bence was more sceptical of the phenomena than the SPR investigator.
I liked Morris and respected his knowledge on what he was doing, while there was an element of caution from me. We were on the landing, the girls were asleep, and there was a moaning. And Morris was really quite excited by this, and clearly thought that there was some kind of outside force trying to express themselves through one of the girls. But it was clear to me with the screaming that the girl was masturbating. Whether she realised that she was putting out false information to Morris or not, I have no idea. There's no doubt what she was doing.
During his time at the house, photographer Graham Morris took photographs which alleged to show a variety of unexplainable activity.
I didn't think I was going to spend the months that I spent up there photographing various things.
This activity occurred most notably in the bedroom now occupied by 11-year-old Janet and 13-year-old Margaret.
Photography was done remotely. I'd be setting up remote cameras, so a lot of it I didn't witness, but I was there just to record it, just to set up cameras and photograph it.
You can actually see the bedclothes being lifted, but more importantly, in the corner of the photograph, there's the actual curtain is wrapping itself around the cover, and it looks like it's involved in pulling the cover off. And it's a small series of photographs, but I found them fascinating.
Although the photographs are compelling, some argue that they are far from definitive evidence of paranormal activity.
For me, the photograph is convincing because I was there and it brings that weird night back to me. But I can't see the picture would do it for someone who was looking at it objectively to prove anything.
As the apparent phenomena went on, Gross soon realised he would need help to document the sheer volume of activity, and was soon joined by Guy Lyon Playfair following that chance meeting at the SPR.
Guy was an SPR member with a little bit more experience in investigating cases. He was also a journalist, but somebody who'd written a number of books on various paranormal phenomena, even at that early stage.
He'd experienced it all before. He'd seen these things before. And he even knew what was going to happen next, which is the fascinating thing. But he made a point of never telling it, which is quite frustrating there, because as a photographer it'd be quite nice to know what's going to happen next so you can get ready for it.
The atmosphere was one of absolute confusion, not knowing what on earth was going to happen next. The girls were aged then 12 and 13. They were losing a lot of sleep. It was affecting their schoolwork. It wasn't nice at all.
However, as the strange events continued, questions started to be asked about Mrs. Hodgson's motives.
There were suggestions at the time that they may have fabricated this scenario in order to get themselves a better house.
My first trick question was, would you like us to ask the council to rehouse you? And she said, no, no way. I don't think Peggy Hodgson had the ability to carry that off, and if she had the ability, I don't think she'd have done it.
As bizarre occurrences continued to plague the Hodgsons, they were about to find themselves at the centre of a media sensation, and their reputations, along with that of Maurice Gross, were about to be called even further into disrepute.
The girls did play a few tricks.
I'm sure they were under pressure to perform.
I wouldn't have taken the girls' words for anything at all.
Apparent paranormal activity was still consuming their home on Green Street in Enfield, North London, and things were about to become even more bizarre for the Hodgson family, as on the 10th of September 1977, their story became a national phenomenon, making the front page of the Daily Mirror.
The Mirror was a very respectable paper. You didn't get silly, nutty stories in the Mirror.
Normally, paranormal sort of like stories are usually tucked, about page 16, 17 in a newspaper, little tiny column. This is like a full page spread, basically saying that this house is haunted.
For the newspaper staff at the centre of this tabloid sensation, this was a story unlike any they'd covered in the past.
Stories fitted a pattern, but this one fits no pattern. This is a one-off story.
The story at the time was completely unique. No one had seen anything like this before.
Each time a representative from the media actually visited the house, they each seemed to have their own personal experiences. And it gave it a more personal edge rather than just kind of a step back, objective reporting about what happened. Here were journalists who were reporting on their own experiences.
The Enfield case was suddenly at the centre of a media frenzy. Yet there arose claims that some members of the press were intent on exposing the story as a hoax, and the Hodgsons as liars.
Several newspapers sent people up there. We had the sort of clever ones who tried to bribe the children into confessing. Two papers did that. They were offered huge sums of money by the 70s standards, and it didn't work.
However, to many, the motives for the press attempting to bribe the family weren't clear.
An expose of fraud in a paranormal case is not so interesting as the real thing. That a story showing that there's a teenage girl who's surrounded by poltergeist activity is a lot more of a seller than teenage girl fakes poltergeist activity.
If you step back and think about a generation ago with the media, you didn't get paranormal stories. So discredit it, shoot it down. The Mirror's, what's up to the Mirror? What are they doing, running ghost stories? Let's take this apart.
As the media continued to turn up on their doorstep, the Hodgsons struggled to cope.
And I just wouldn't have brought more trauma on that family. They had this bloody unexplained phenomenon, which we'll say is, which is now pretty well documented as a poltergeist. A mother who was not in good health. You don't want to bring a load of bloody tabloid journalism banging on the door. It's just awful. They're in a mess. They need help.
As the media presence continued, rumours persisted about the authenticity of some of the phenomena, and in particular, the part played in the events by Peggy's daughters, Margaret and Janet.
I'm afraid at the time I wouldn't have taken the girls' words for anything at all, because it was clear that they were really having a good time, and it was very nice for them having Maurice there. He was like having a sort of substitute father.
In terms of whether Janet and Margaret actually faked anything between themselves, there is no doubt that that's what they did.
I think inevitably, with the continual media interest, they were encouraged to perform. I don't think Mrs. Hodgson would have approved of that, but I'm sure they were under pressure to perform. And I think both girls have admitted subsequently that they did.
I think they said that whenever they faked anything, that Maurice or Guy or both of them always knew about it.
The girls did play a few tricks, as I would have expected. Children learn everything by imitation, so if they wanted to imitate the phenomena that were going on, that's quite normal. It doesn't avoid the fact that what they were imitating was genuine, which of course it was, because how would they know what to make up? I mean, they'd have to fake the right effect of something that had been recorded before, because a poltergeist has got a very limited repertoire. They've got about 18 to 20 tricks, and that's it. So much of the real stuff was happening, and how you distinguish is really quite easy. I mean, if you're sitting in front of me now, and I get up, and this chair suddenly follows me across the room and turns over, I don't think you're going to suspect trickery.
Margaret and Janet's pranks were doing little to help legitimise the case. Skeptics were asking, if real paranormal phenomena is occurring, why should they feel the need to fake?
Why did they bother to fake when some genuine things were happening? I think there's a lot of mediums, in fact, who do that, keep things going. And therefore one mustn't always feel that if a medium is cheated, that's the end of the medium. I think sometimes it's a case of priming the pump. You fake something and then something genuine happens.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that evidence of fraud weakens the real evidence.
Gross and Playfair, convinced the Hodgsons were genuine, continued to record an enormous amount of unusual occurrences.
A lot of activity in the bedroom, the girls being sort of shaken and bounced up and down and thrown out of bed. We even had a box of matches caught fire, or rather was burned on the top. without the matches themselves igniting. The heavy leather armchair flipping over backwards was quite definitely the most impressive. It was broad daylight and it was right in front of my nose, and nobody was anywhere near it.
However, as the investigators spent more and more time with the family, doubts concerning Gross's objectivity began to surface.
Two investigators spent an extraordinary amount of time in the house, far more really than in most cases.
Morris, as always, came out with instant reasons for everything happening, and it was always attached with something to do with poltergeist.
Morris certainly considered it the most fantastic thing that had ever happened.
I was very wary of his initial observations because he wanted to see things.
After a while, maybe I'm cynical or whatever, I just find it was a bit too wanting to read too much into it.
Morris accepted as genuine a lot of phenomena that he did not personally see, and accepted the word of the family for a lot of things.
If you're a member of something like the Psycho Research Society and you believe in the paranormal and you want to see paranormal manifestations, you'll find it.
Gross had suffered a bereavement barely a year earlier, and some thought that this was causing him to place too much faith in the Hodgsons' claims.
The whole affair was a very big thing in Morris's life, because he'd lost his own daughter, also called Janet. This to him was really proof of the paranormal, and probably proof to him of survival too.
Well, I thought for Morris to have lost his daughter a year before, it's got to have been in the back of his mind, I would have thought.
To try and speculate that he may have lost all objectivity, I don't think it's a very good explanation. Morris, from a very early point in the investigation, was looking at this very much as a poltergeist case. He was looking at it as possibly occurrence of psychokinesis. At no point in the case was there any sort of confirmatory aspect for Morris that Janet was trying to communicate with him, or that in solving this case it would help him deal with the loss of his daughter.
The legitimacy of Gross's testimony is backed up by the fact that others were also witness to much of the strange phenomena, and this activity continued, including problems with Graham Morris's camera equipment.
Graham Morris, the photographer, a very highly experienced professional Fleet Street man, he charged up his flash guns one night, and when he started taking pictures found they'd all discharged at once, which is pretty unlikely. In fact, it's not possible.
I had a flash gun, or maybe even two flash guns that were fully charged, always fully charged before getting there, and then trying to use not one but two of them, and the power drained from them. And that was, I couldn't answer that, and there was no reason for that. I'd never seen it happen before. It's certainly never happened since.
And it wasn't just the newspaper men who experienced problems with technical equipment.
We had a video recorder with an infrared lens where we were hoping to film something happening in the dark, and all that would happen was that when they switched the machine on, all the lights came on simultaneously. You know, fast forward, back, play, and so on, which they said was not possible. But there it was.
Despite the investigators' best efforts, no video footage of any of the reported phenomena was captured.
In the Enfield poltergeist, we don't have any footage. All we have is some photographs and the accounts of the people that were involved, either the family or witnesses or the investigators.
If I could go back with the gear that you have now, the equipment, the technology there is now, you'd be laughing. You'd either photograph everything, or you'd show it all up completely to be fraud if that were the case, which I doubt. But you'd have a lot more on film, or digital. You'd have video running, all sorts of things.
Despite no video evidence, more and more unexplainable phenomena continued to be reported. The knocking on the walls continued. There were outbreaks of fire that disappeared as quickly as they started. and the curtains in the bedroom are seen to blow in the wind, even when the windows are closed. But most disturbingly, the activity was seen to centre more specifically around 12-year-old Janet.
Janet was sedated for her own safety.
It was when she was there that things happened.
Janet was the epicenter of the whole thing, common denominator of everything that happened.
Following the extensive media coverage, by November 1977, the Enfield poltergeist was the most famous paranormal case in British history, and the family were now minor celebrities.
You ended up getting more and more people coming to the house just to witness things. It ended up like a sort of Victorian sideshow, the Elephant Man almost.
It must have been awful for them. Life itself was difficult without having a poltergeist, throwing its weight around the place, throwing its energy around the place.
And it was becoming increasingly obvious that one member of the family in particular was at the centre of the activity.
Janet was always the focal point. It was when she was there that things happened. So when she was there with her sister, her brother, her mother, the Nottinghams, it was always Janet when things happened.
Janet was a very lively kid, very athletic, pretty well behaved, I would say. She was always very polite with us. She was good at school. She was learning quite a few subjects and seemed to get on well with everybody.
She was a very normal child, yeah. I mean, there was nothing odd about her in any way. She was good at school. I used to help her out with her homework. She was doing, I think, French and German. Sorry about the others, but I mean, she was the brightest of the family.
Numerous small objects used to fly around near her, and on more than one occasion, heavy chairs and sofa would flip over when she was around. And yes, she saw it all.
She'd come home from school with stories about how things were happening in the classroom. She'd go down the shops and cans would fly off the shelf in the local supermarket. Janet was the epicenter of the whole thing, common denominator of everything that happened.
So why did these events apparently focus on a seemingly normal young girl?
There's a popular belief that poltergeists are related to the age of puberty. It seems to me that it must have something to do with a sudden extra release of energy, which the onset of menses presumably releases. And don't quite know why this should be significant, but it's been noted often enough to make it pretty well accepted.
Usually you find the activity centres around prepubescent children, children just about to go into puberty. It seems to be centred around the hypothalamus in the brain. That seems to be the area of the brain that sort of lights up when paranormal phenomena is occurring. And so it's no real surprise to then say that there's a child going through an emotional change, a chemical change as well. Could this be the prime conditions, this sort of chemical driving sort of thing that creates side effects, PK effects in people?
The focus of the poltergeist activity, in this particular case Janet, may be consciously or unconsciously causing the phenomena using psychokinesis.
I'm sure it was a subconscious cry for help. It seemed to me like she's trying to communicate with Dad who isn't there, Mum who hasn't got time to talk back, brother who isn't there, other brother who can't really communicate with you, sister who cries at the drop of a hat. Who did she talk to?
In December 1977, the activity around Janet became even more pronounced.
Oh, the main event, without any doubt, was that the day when Janet had her menarche for her first period. Our colleague, who was a student of physics, he was very interested in this idea of matter passing through matter, and he took this cushion into the bedroom, as I recall, and asked Janet to see if she could get it downstairs without opening the door, which would be very good evidence. The next thing we knew was that it was on the roof. Instead of going down through the floor, it went upwards, and the local baker was walking along the pavement towards the house and suddenly saw it. He said there was nobody leaning out the window, nobody threw it. One minute it wasn't there, and the next minute it was.
According to eyewitness reports at the time, a large red cushion materialised out of thin air above the Hodgson house.
You're suddenly confronted with something like that. It's a terrific shock to the system. I mean, you know it can't have happened, but you know it did. And I got it down with great difficulty, I may say. I nearly fell out of the window. And there's just no way that I could have got that cushion onto the roof normally. And if I couldn't, I don't think a 12-year-old girl could either.
However, the day's strange events weren't over yet.
On the same day, a colleague of ours asked Janet deliberately if she could make something go through the floor to the room below. And the next thing we knew was that Janet claimed to have floated into the house next door through the wall, and she described the neighbour's bedroom, where she'd certainly never been, quite accurately, and said she'd left something behind in there. So we made arrangements when we could to go round, and sure enough there was a book belonging to Janet in the neighbour's bedroom.
I met Mrs. Nottingham from next door, and who I must say did talk about some pretty hair-raising things. Well, it sounded rather as if some book that ought to have been in the Hodgson house ended up in her house, and things came through the wall.
Oh, suitably enough, the book was called Fun and Games for Children, which was quite appropriate. But there's just no way at all that she could have got in there normally. The house was locked, the neighbour was out, and you couldn't get through the window, you couldn't even get up the chimney. We checked that, it became blocked off. And yet the book was found next door, so it had gone through the wall.
It does stretch credibility, doesn't it? You know, it sounds absolutely fantastic to think that a child can, dematerialise or go through a wall and deposit something and come back. We have to rely on the people there at the time. We can do nothing more than just take their word for it. But with the weight of everything else that was reported by other people, then it doesn't surprise me in the least that these sort of things were reported there.
Just when things seemed they couldn't get more bizarre, they did.
The levitation started off with the girls sort of just sliding out of bed, and then it got more and more impressive, and then we ended up with a sequence of pictures of them, what I'm told is levitating.
Do these pictures, taken remotely by photographer Graham Morris, actually show Janet levitating?
Pictures don't lie, let's put it that way. The pictures that you see actually happened. Whatever it was happened. What caused it to happen, I'll leave everybody else to work that one out. I just know that when that camera went off, it photographed about 5 frames of a girl starting off, coming out of bed, and then ending up on the floor.
The increasing unpredictability of the apparent phenomena surrounding Janet raised some serious concerns for her well-being.
There have been incidents of levitation and bedclothes being pulled, and the investigators at the time were concerned about her safety.
The doctor came round and gave her a shot, and he said something like this would put a horse or an elephant out, and she's still fighting, and it ended up with about 2 or 3 of us trying to hold her down, and this was after the sedation.
Later on that night, she was found 10-15 feet at the other end of the room, up on a dresser. That's quite a shocking thing in itself.
We were all downstairs, big bang, everyone rushes upstairs, her uncle goes in first, finds her on the radio, I walk in with the camera, banged. How did she get there? I'll leave that for all the others to try and work out.
In spite of the best efforts of the investigators and medical professionals, this apparent levitation continued.